20, and it's called the Atlantic world. And this chapter covers everything from 1492 all the way up to 1800. And so as we talk about how Europeans explored and colonized the Americas, this was a really disrupting event for Native American cultures. It also led to the rise of the slave trade and the plantation system. And so many of the things that we have to talk about have a distasteful legacy, but here we are. It's still an incredibly important event, and it warrants discussion. Here's a painting of Columbus, looking all heroic with his capris, and he's pointing west, and encouraging people to get on the boats and go to the New World. This is a bit of colonization propaganda, if you will. It's like a sales ad. Hey, come to the New World. It's going to be amazing. It's this way. and people do go by the millions into these colonies in the New World. So many so, in fact, that here's what the New World looked like by 1700. The viceroyalty of New Spain is what was once the Aztec Empire, the Inca. Now we think of it as Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Panama, etc. And even as you see, much of the Southwest is encompassed here. You can see the original 13 colonies of the English. Nora mentioned French culture. Louisiana is important, but also even think about Quebec, and you see how New France, also known as Quebec, it came further south than you might realize. That even like the Ohio territories once belonged to France, and then you see the Portuguese influence here with Brazil. And so we'll spend most of our time today talking about section 1 of chapter 20 and thinking about how Spain built an American empire. And really the voyages of Christopher Columbus and their effects and how it prompted the Spanish to establish these colonies in the Americas. So when Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, I can't help myself, when he crossed and found the island of Taino, he thought he had reached the East Indies, these series of islands off the coast of India. And so that's where the mistaken nomenclature of Los Indios, or Indians, came from. There's a lot of consciousness now to use the term Native American or whatever someone might choose to be called. If they prefer Cherokee, call them a Cherokee. Everyone has the right to be called what they would like. But the misconception of natives as Indians does date back to this. Now, like I said, he didn't actually land in Mexico. He didn't actually land in the Americas. He landed on an island, probably in the Bahamas, in the Caribbean. Now, if you go to the Bahamas, they're beautiful. Small islands, great beaches, crystal clear blue water, but you're not going to find great sums of gold. What you will find there are people that have lived there for thousands of years. And of course, you'll also find evidence of Spanish colonization dating back to the 1400s from these first Spanish colonies that became kind of eventually independent nations. Now, the voyages of Columbus. He went back multiple times, and other explorers took to the seas as well, as like Pedro Alvarez, who claimed Brazil for the Portuguese. If you've ever wondered where the name America came from, it's from Amerigo Vespucci, who identified South America as a new continent. So yeah, there's where America came from. Amerigo Vespucci. In 1507, the continent America was named. This German map maker kind of took a play on Amerigo's name and named the continent America. The first to reach the Pacific Ocean is Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who actually went around the tip of South America and found the Pacific Ocean. And then, Magellan set out on this quest to go all the way around the world. So now that it's evident you can sail west and find land, what happens if you keep going? And so Magellan made the attempt, died en route, but many of his people made it back. And they were gone. It's an amazing journey. Read the stories of Magellan sometimes. 3 years they were at sea. Their captain died en route. A few made it back alive. This is what one of the earliest maps of the Americas drawn by this German map maker looked like. Notice that it's exaggerated. You're mainly seeing the Viceroyalty of Spain, what you think of now as Central America. You can also see the 13 English colonies, but it's not quite to perspective. Here is a painting of the famous Hernan Cortez meeting the Emperor of the Aztecs, Montezuma. And of course, this story is from the famous Spanish conquest of Mexico. In 1519, Hernando Cortez landed in Mexico. And this moment is one of those pivotal moments. Of course, he later became known as a conquistador or conqueror, and went on to conquer the Aztecs. When he first landed, he had 600 men with him. And they landed around where Veracruz is today. And as they moved westward, closer to Tenochtitlan, within 2 years, they conquered the Aztec Empire. The story is incredible. How 600 men conquered the Aztec Empire? Are you kidding me? Well, for one, these 600 men were riding horses. Horses were once native to the Western Hemisphere, but had gone extinct thousands of years before the landing of Cortez. So no Aztec person had ever seen a horse. They had also never seen steel armor or gunpowder weapons. And Cortez still probably couldn't have pulled it off, but he had help. You see, the Aztecs had a policy of practicing human sacrifice. And as a powerful and bloodthirsty empire, they cruelly ruled over all the surrounding territories. And so when Cortez proved himself to be a force to be reckoned with, native allies began to join his cause. And by the time they reached Tenochtitlan, what we now call Mexico City, Montezuma, emperor of the Aztecs, realized that Cortez was a force that he's going to have to deal with. And so he invited the Spanish to come as guests. Now, as the story goes, the Spanish resided as guests in Tenochtitlan, but still had the ultimate objective of conquering. And so a fight broke out. The Spanish had to escape the city, but came back with renewed numbers and native allies and conquered the most powerful empire in Central America. And one of their best weapons was completely unintentional, and that was disease. Wiped out huge numbers of Aztecs. Of course, Cortez was not the only of the conquistadors. The Spanish conqueror Francisco Pizarro led a force into Peru in 1532. He went on to kill the ruler of the Inca. And there's another amazing story here. The conquistadors captured the ruler of Inca and demanded a ransom of a room full of gold. And the Inca provided the ransom. Now, you can imagine how these conquerors, who were obviously looking for gold, reacted to this. An entire room full of gold. The Inca were prepared to pay for their ruler. And so they took the ransom, and they killed the emperor anyway. And to seek revenge, the Inca spread a legend of a city called El Dorado, the city of gold, and told Pizarro and his men that deep in the jungles there's this incredible city where the streets are paved with gold, where gold is in the buildings, gold is in the streets, it flows in the rivers. And Pizarro and his men believed them and went into the jungle in search of El Dorado. Only a few men ever made it back alive. And the stories they told were believed to be insane and have only recently been proven true. Now, they told of cannibals, which we know is true. They told of snakes that could eat people, also true. But they told of rivers that boiled. Now, most people thought they were insane anyway because, the stories they told were crazy. I mean, many of them did actually go insane. Pizarro declared himself king of Spain and went mad and died somewhere in the jungle. But a few of his men did come back and tell these extraordinary stories. But the rivers that boiled fascinated many people. And scientists have explored the jungle now and have found these rivers that are boiling. Geothermic vents that come out, kind of exposure to the Earth's crust deep within has superheated these waters, and you can go to certain places and find rivers that boil deep in the jungle. So anyway, Pizarro and his men met an unfortunate end, but that still didn't stop the pattern of conquest. Many of these conquistadors married native women, having children. The result is a whole new ethnic group. Some of you have native and Spanish ancestry. That is called mestizo. Mestizo ethnic group resulted from the conquest, but also the plantation-based system of encomienda, and that is that the Spanish forced the natives to do work for them. The Portuguese began to settle Brazil. And of course, just like the other places, began setting up plantations. If you go to South Central America or parts of Brazil, these are extremely humid tropical conditions, very conducive for rice, for sugar, for tobacco, for cotton, for mass farming plantations. For example, sugar requires a long growing season, abundant rainfall, hot, humid conditions. Brazil, southern Mexico, even Cuba or Hawaii were later colonies that were based around sugar. Now, the Spanish conquest into the Americas brought great wealth to Spain. So much gold was brought back from the New World that it actually affected the value of gold, caused a devaluing of gold as a currency. I mean, just so much gold. It was ridiculous. What did Spain do with all this gold? Well, for one, it reinvested that gold into their navy, and they built up the largest armada on the planet. Many conquistadors also claimed lands in the north, like Florida, for Spain by Ponce de Leon. I'm sure you know the story of the Fountain of Youth and Juan Ponce de Leon. He believed that one of the springs in Florida, and if you've ever been to the springs in Florida, they're beautiful and they're clear and they're cold and refreshing, deep in a really hot state. So you jump in it, it's great. And so he thought one of these might be the fountain of youth, the secret to eternal youth. In the Southwest, many of these lands, like Arizona and New Mexico, were explored by Francisco Coronado. Found little gold there, but many lands of great import that are going to be settled later. But of course, with all of these conquistadors came priests and missionaries who established missions throughout the Southwest. Like the Spanish capital of Santa Fe. But some of the problems with this. For one, the Spanish looked down upon the Native Americans and treated them poorly. And guess who began to report the situations of abuse? The priest and the friars and the missionaries, the ones who most closely served these people. For example, Bartolomeo de la Casa wrote extensively about how the encomienda system was a violation of Christendom, how enslaving people was wrong, and how the horrible things done to the natives is hypocritical to the mission that the Spanish had in mind and what Catholicism was all about. And so eventually, King Henry V of Spain, Charles V of Spain, abolished encomienda. But there's a bit of an economic problem. So if the Spanish are no longer allowed to enslave the natives, and they still need a large labor force, they began to seek other sources of labor. And unfortunately, this led to the slave trade, the African slave trade, that is. Portuguese traders began to leave their ports in Portugal and stop at African West Coast, kind of like states like Ghana or Mali, and trade for slaves. And Africans were loaded onto these boats. And I've got some stuff to show you about the Middle Passage a little later, and how Africans began to be brought to the New World as slaves. There were cases of resistance, and one of my favorite movies about the Middle Passage and resistance of African slaves being brought over is Amistad. Check it out. I think I've got a clip to show you in just a moment.